Isabella I of Castile, a name that echoes through the halls of history, stands as one of Europe's most formidable and transformative rulers. Her reign, spanning from the late 15th century, was marked by both extraordinary triumphs and controversial decisions that would shape the course of nations for centuries to come. Often heralded as Europe's first great queen, Isabella's legacy is far from simple. It is a tapestry of power, faith, conquest, and complicated moral choices. From uniting a fractured Spain to sponsoring the voyage that led to the discovery of the New World, Isabella's influence stretched far beyond the borders of her kingdom, cementing her place in history as a monarch who redefined what it meant to rule. Yet, her legacy is equally defined by the shadows cast over her reign: the brutal Spanish Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, and the darker sides of her unwavering religious zeal. In the story of Isabella I, we find a queen who embodied both the heights of ambition and the depths of moral ambiguity. In the grand tapestry of European history, few figures have had as profound an impact as Isabella I of Castile. Revered by historians and scholars alike, Isabella's legacy stretches far beyond the borders of her own kingdom, shaping the course of Spain's future and influencing the broader European landscape. Her reign marked the beginning of a new era, one characterized by strong centralized rule, religious consolidation, and the dawn of overseas exploration. To understand Isabella's historical importance is to recognize how a single monarch's vision, determination, and political acumen could transform a fractured realm into a powerful, unified state poised to dominate world affairs for centuries. The world Isabella was born into was one of deep political instability and persistent conflict. The 15th century in Europe was a period of transition. The remnants of medieval feudalism were giving way to the early structures of nation-states. In England, the Wars of the Roses raged, weakening royal authority. France, too, was emerging battered but stronger from the devastation of the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of semi-independent principalities, and Italy was a mosaic of fiercely competitive city-states. Meanwhile, the Iberian Peninsula was deeply fragmented. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal each pursued their interests, while the Muslim kingdom of Granada still clung to the southern tip of Spain. Internal rivalries, noble insurrections, and a lack of strong leadership plagued Castile, the largest of the Spanish kingdoms. It was into this volatile environment that Isabella emerged, a woman uniquely positioned, and uniquely determined, to leave her mark. Despite the challenges of her era, Isabella's ascent to power was a testament to her intelligence and resolve. In an age when women rulers were often seen as anomalies, she demonstrated not only her right to rule but also her capacity to govern with unmatched competence. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, forged in secret and against considerable odds, would prove a masterstroke of political strategy. Together, they formed a partnership often romanticized by historians but fundamentally rooted in shared governance and mutual ambition. Yet, it was Isabella who brought Castile, the wealthier and more populous of the two realms, to the table, and it was her singular vision that largely steered the course of their joint reign. Isabella is often referred to as Europe's first great queen, a title that encapsulates the breadth and depth of her achievements. Unlike queens consort who were relegated to ceremonial roles, Isabella wielded actual sovereign power. She was crowned queen in her own right, not merely as the wife of a king. Her reign was marked by a series of bold initiatives that reshaped the political, religious, and cultural life of her kingdom. She reigned in the unruly nobility, restored royal authority, and restructured the government to ensure greater efficiency and loyalty. Through the establishment of the Santa Hermandad, a national militia, she significantly reduced lawlessness and asserted centralized control. Her commitment to religious unity, although controversial by modern standards, reflected the prevailing ethos of her time, and through measures like the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, she sought to create a cohesive Christian identity for her realm. Beyond her domestic achievements, Isabella's impact on world history is undeniable. It was under her patronage that Christopher Columbus embarked on his fateful voyage in 1492, leading to the European discovery of the New World. This single decision would unleash a cascade of events that altered global trade, geopolitics, and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Isabella's foresight in supporting exploration and expansion laid the foundations for Spain's emergence as a global empire, the first of its kind. In this sense, her influence extended far beyond Europe's shores, setting the stage for the modern age of exploration and colonization. Yet, to portray Isabella solely as a figure of triumph would be to oversimplify her complex legacy. Her reign also witnessed the expulsion of Jews from Spain, an act that, while consistent with the religious orthodoxy of her time, caused untold suffering and economic disruption. The forced conversions of Muslims and Jews alike under the auspices of the Inquisition remain among the darker aspects of her rule. These actions, motivated by a desire for religious unity and national consolidation, reflect the tensions and contradictions inherent in her leadership. Visionary and progressive in some respects, yet intolerant and repressive in others. Nonetheless, Isabella's broader contribution to the development of the modern Spanish state cannot be overstated. She played a critical role in uniting the crowns of Castile and Aragon, laying the groundwork for a unified Spain. Her insistence on strong, centralized monarchy served as a model for other European rulers who sought to consolidate their power in the centuries that followed. In many ways, the rise of absolutist monarchies in the early modern period owes much to the precedents set during her reign. Moreover, her emphasis on education, the arts, and religious devotion helped to foster the cultural flowering that would later culminate in Spain's Siglo de Oro, or Golden Age. Isabella I of Castile was not merely a queen. She was a transformative leader whose reign altered the trajectory of both Spain and Europe. Her life and legacy embody the complexities of an age in transition, a time when medieval structures were crumbling and the modern world was beginning to take shape. Through a combination of personal strength, political shrewdness, and unwavering vision, Isabella forged a new path for her kingdom and left an indelible mark on history. Her story is one of ambition and sacrifice, of glory and tragedy, and above all, of a woman who dared to reimagine the possibilities of power and governance at a pivotal moment in European history. Isabella I of Castile was born into a world that was both turbulent and deeply influential in shaping her destiny. She belonged to the powerful house of Trastamara, a royal dynasty that had risen to prominence in the 14th century. The House of Trastamara had a complex and often violent history, marked by internal strife, wars of succession, and political intrigue. This lineage would leave a profound imprint on Isabella's personality and her later approach to governance. Born on April 22, 1451, in the modest town of Madrigal de los Altos Torres in the Kingdom of Castile, Isabella entered a Spain divided by factionalism and political uncertainty. Her father, King John II of Castile, was a ruler whose reign was dominated by his favorite, Álvaro de Luna, and whose leadership was generally regarded as weak and heavily influenced by court favorites. Isabella's mother, Isabella of Portugal, came from another line of nobility and was known for her strong religious devotion, traits that she would pass down to her daughter. At the time of Isabella's birth, Europe was undergoing massive transformations. The 15th century was a period of transition. The medieval world was giving way to the early modern period. In Castile and much of Europe, monarchs were grappling with the rising power of the nobility, the emerging merchant class, and the challenges posed by both internal and external enemies. In Castile, the political situation was particularly unstable. The death of King John II in 1454, when Isabella was just 3 years old, led to the ascension of her much older half-brother, Henry IV. Henry's reign would be plagued by accusations of weakness, personal scandal, and a general inability to govern effectively, setting the stage for Isabella's future struggles and her eventual rise to power. After the death of her father, Isabella's early life was marked by significant shifts. Initially, she and her younger brother Alfonso were under the care of their mother. However, financial difficulties and the declining mental health of her mother led to their being moved to the court of King Henry IV. Life at court was far from ideal. Isabella quickly learned that political favor was a currency often traded in whispers and treachery. She grew up observing how alliances shifted like sand and how loyalty could be bought or betrayed for personal gain. These early experiences taught her crucial lessons about the nature of power, trust, and the delicate balance needed to maintain authority. Despite the instability surrounding her, Isabella received an exceptional education for a woman of her time. Her studies were deeply rooted in religious teachings, reflective of the broader Christian fervor sweeping across Europe. She developed a profound devotion to Catholicism, which would later play a central role in her policies as queen. Alongside religious instruction, Isabella was taught Latin, history, philosophy, and the principles of governance. Her education fostered a strong intellectual foundation that enabled her to engage with political ideas and strategies with remarkable sophistication. It was rare for women, even royal women, to be given such comprehensive education, but Isabella's upbringing prepared her for the monumental role she was destined to play. During her formative years, Isabella also bore witness to the ceaseless dynastic struggles that plagued Castile. Her half-brother Henry IV's rule was marred by constant unrest and challenges to his legitimacy. Henry's marriage to Joan of Portugal and the subsequent birth of their daughter Joanna, infamously nicknamed La Beltraneja, due to rumors that she was not Henry's biological child, only fueled the political fires. Many nobles doubted Joanna's legitimacy and sought an alternative heir to the throne. Isabella, along with her younger brother Alfonso, became central figures in the web of political machinations. Initially, attention focused on Alfonso as a potential rival to Henry. However, after Alfonso's mysterious death in 1468, Isabella emerged as the primary contender. The court of Castile during Henry IV's reign was a hotbed of factionalism, manipulation, and self-interest. Various noble houses vied for influence, forming shifting alliances to bolster their power and undermine rivals. Isabella, even as a teenager, showed a remarkable ability to navigate these treacherous waters. She cultivated relationships carefully, demonstrating wisdom and patience beyond her years. Rather than rushing into rash alliances, she maintained a cautious independence that preserved her potential claim to the throne while allowing her to observe and understand the dynamics of power at court. One of the most contentious issues during this period was the matter of Isabella's marriage. In an era when dynastic marriages were pivotal to securing political alliances, the question of whom Isabella would marry became a matter of national and even international significance. King Henry IV sought to use Isabella's marriage as a political tool, attempting to marry her off to allies who could reinforce his precarious position. At various times, potential suitors included Portuguese, French, and English princes, each representing different political factions within Castile and abroad. However, Isabella, demonstrating a firm sense of agency unusual for a woman of her time, insisted on having a say in her choice of husband. She recognized that the wrong marriage could not only jeopardize her own ambitions but also destabilize Castile further. Her eventual choice of Ferdinand of Aragon was a masterstroke. In secret, without Henry's approval, Isabella negotiated and agreed to marry Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Aragon. Their union would later prove to be one of the most significant political alliances in European history, ultimately leading to the unification of Spain. But at the time, the marriage was fraught with risk. By defying Henry, Isabella risked losing her claim to the Castilian throne and plunging the kingdom into deeper conflict. Nevertheless, she proceeded with characteristic resolve, believing that the partnership with Ferdinand would strengthen her position and secure her vision for a stronger, more centralized Spain. Even before her marriage, Isabella's character had already begun to set her apart from her contemporaries. While many royal women of the time were treated as pawns in the games of dynastic politics, Isabella demonstrated an unusual degree of autonomy and political acumen. She combined a deeply ingrained sense of duty and religiosity with a pragmatic approach to politics, understanding that moral conviction needed to be paired with decisive action in order to effect real change. Her upbringing amidst political instability and her exposure to the workings of courtly intrigue shaped her into a ruler who was both principled and ruthless when necessary. The events of Isabella's early life laid the foundation for her later achievements. Her experiences navigating the treacherous waters of the Castilian court, her deep and abiding faith, her education in both the religious and secular arts, and her acute understanding of the political landscape all contributed to the formidable queen she would become. She learned that in a world governed by shifting alliances and fragile loyalties, strength of character and clarity of purpose were essential for survival and success. Isabella's youth was not merely a prelude to her reign. It was the crucible in which her formidable will and vision for a united Spain were forged. Thus, by the time she ascended to the throne, Isabella was uniquely prepared to meet the enormous challenges that awaited her. The early trials she faced imbued her with resilience and a sense of destiny that would fuel her efforts to transform not only Castile but the entire Iberian Peninsula. Her story is one of perseverance, strategic brilliance, and unyielding faith, qualities that were shaped in the tumultuous and often dangerous environment of her early years. The dynastic struggles, the court intrigues, the battles over marriage and succession, all these experiences honed Isabella into a leader who would leave an indelible mark on history. Isabella's path to power was neither simple nor assured. From a young age, she had been thrust into a political environment filled with schemes and ambitions. Her future was a matter of public interest and intense political maneuvering, where marriage proposals were not simply personal decisions but vital instruments of diplomacy and power. Throughout her youth, Isabella's hand in marriage was the subject of multiple negotiations. Various European powers saw her as a valuable asset for forging alliances. Proposals came from far and wide. One of the early suitors was Ferdinand of Aragon, whose marriage to Isabella had the potential to unite two powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. However, other matches were also considered. Alfonso V of Portugal, a powerful and ambitious monarch, sought to solidify his influence over Castile by marrying Isabella. Even domestic figures within Castile, such as members of influential noble families, were entertained as possibilities to maintain internal stability. Every proposal carried with it different political implications, and Isabella had to navigate these turbulent waters carefully. Isabella demonstrated considerable political acumen during these negotiations. She understood that her choice of husband would define her future authority. King Henry IV, her half-brother, tried to manipulate her marriage for his own political gain, suggesting suitors who were favorable to his court's interests. But Isabella was not easily swayed. She made it clear that she would only marry with the consent of the Castilian Cortes, and according to her own judgment. This was a bold stance for a princess whose fate was considered a tool of political expediency. Her most critical and daring decision came with her secret marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. Knowing that her union with Ferdinand would likely provoke the ire of her half-brother and his court, Isabella orchestrated the marriage clandestinely. To avoid Henry IV's interference, she and Ferdinand communicated secretly, and arrangements were made for a discreet ceremony. To secure ecclesiastical approval and bypass potential legal objections, a papal dispensation was sought and, in fact, a fraudulent one was produced by Ferdinand's supporters, given the close blood relation between the two. Their marriage in the Palacio de los Vivero in Valladolid was a momentous event that changed the trajectory of Spanish history. This union was not just a marriage of two individuals but a strategic alliance between Castile and Aragon. Ferdinand brought with him the promise of military support and political stability, while Isabella's claim to the Castilian throne gave him access to one of the most prosperous kingdoms in Europe. They agreed to rule as equals, an unusual arrangement that underscored Isabella's determination to retain her authority and not be subsumed under her husband's power. However, their marriage set off a chain reaction of political instability. King Henry IV, feeling betrayed, repudiated Isabella's claim to the throne and instead named his daughter, Joanna la Beltraneja, as his legitimate heir. This decision plunged Castile into a period of intense conflict known as the War of the Castilian Succession. Joanna la Beltraneja's claim was controversial. Many doubted her legitimacy, with rumors suggesting that she was not truly Henry's daughter but rather the offspring of an adulterous affair between Queen Joan of Portugal and Beltrán de la Cueva, a favorite courtier. This scandal earned Joanna the derisive nickname La Beltraneja. Yet despite these whispers, significant factions within Castile and the neighboring Kingdom of Portugal rallied behind her claim, seeking to prevent Isabella from ascending the throne. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. Battles were fought not just with swords but also with marriages, alliances, and political persuasion. Isabella and Ferdinand had to rely on their diplomatic skills as much as their military prowess. The conflict saw key battles, such as the Battle of Toro in 1476, which, while inconclusive militarily, had massive psychological importance. Although both sides claimed victory, Isabella and Ferdinand skillfully used propaganda to portray it as a decisive win for their cause, boosting their support among the Castilian nobility and populace. Throughout the conflict, Isabella demonstrated remarkable leadership. She traveled extensively across Castile, winning over towns and nobles with promises of justice, stability, and religious reform. Her personal charisma, combined with her steadfastness, inspired loyalty even in those who had initially hesitated to support her. Ferdinand, while an able commander, often had to defer to Isabella's superior understanding of Castilian politics. The war also involved shifting alliances. Initially, Portugal under King Alfonso V supported Joana la Beltraneja, even marrying her to strengthen her claim. However, after a series of setbacks and the failure to rally enough internal Castilian support, Portugal's enthusiasm waned. Isabella's diplomatic efforts, including her strengthening of ties with influential nobles and her offering of conciliatory terms to former opponents, gradually isolated Joanna and her supporters. The end of the war was formally sealed by the Treaty of Alcacovas in 1479. This treaty marked Isabella's recognition as the legitimate Queen of Castile, while Joanna was relegated to a convent life, effectively ending her political ambitions. Portugal, in return for its withdrawal, received guarantees regarding its claims in Africa and the Atlantic Islands, laying the groundwork for its later overseas empire. The treaty also included clauses that regulated the future marriages between the Spanish and Portuguese royal families to ensure peace and cooperation. With the war concluded, Isabella and Ferdinand faced the monumental task of consolidating their power. While Isabella had been recognized as queen, the political reality was complex. Castile was a kingdom of powerful nobles and semi-autonomous cities, and maintaining royal authority required delicate balancing acts. Isabella and Ferdinand worked systematically to bring order. They reinforced royal authority by re-establishing the Hermandad, a kind of municipal police force that curbed lawlessness and strengthened central control. They also instituted judicial reforms that made the royal courts more accessible and reliable than the often arbitrary justice of local lords. These efforts not only increased royal prestige but also won the loyalty of the common people, who were weary of noble abuses. A major challenge was managing the relationship between Castile and Aragon. Although united in marriage, the two kingdoms retained their own laws, institutions, and customs. Isabella astutely respected these differences, ensuring that neither kingdom felt dominated by the other. In matters of governance, they coordinated their policies carefully but ruled their respective domains separately. This dual monarchy model would become a hallmark of their reign. Isabella's skill as a ruler was evident in her balancing of competing interests. She maintained the support of the nobility without allowing them to regain the dominance they had enjoyed under Henry IV. She cultivated alliances with the Church, strengthening religious institutions but also asserting the crown's authority over ecclesiastical appointments. She championed a vision of monarchy that was divinely ordained but rooted in the welfare of her people. The consolidation of power was not merely political but also ideological. Isabella presented her rule as a divine mission to restore moral and religious order to Castile. Her personal piety, strict adherence to Catholic orthodoxy, and patronage of religious reforms helped cement her legitimacy in the eyes of her subjects. This religious vision would later manifest in more dramatic ways, including the completion of the Reconquista and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, but even in these early years, the seeds were being sown. By the early 1480s, Isabella had achieved what many had deemed impossible. From a politically marginalized princess, she had risen to become the undisputed Queen of Castile, ruling alongside her husband Ferdinand. Their marriage would eventually lead to the unification of Spain, but even at this early stage, their reign represented a new model of monarchy: disciplined, devout, and determined. The challenges Isabella overcame in these formative years of her reign shaped her character and defined her legacy. Her ability to navigate marriage negotiations, wage and win a succession war, and consolidate power in a fractious kingdom showcased a political genius rare even among the greatest rulers of history. Her ascent to power was not merely a matter of fortunate circumstance but the result of extraordinary vision, courage, and an unshakable will to rule. Isabella's reign marked a transformative period in Spanish history, characterized by an intense and deliberate strengthening of the monarchy. Upon securing her throne, Isabella recognized that true authority could not rest solely on royal blood. It needed firm foundations in governance, law, and social control. The Spanish nobility, accustomed to their own semi-autonomous rule over vast estates and private armies, posed the first major challenge to the central authority Isabella envisioned. Their influence was deeply entrenched, but Isabella was methodical. She worked to reduce their power not through overt confrontation, which might have sparked civil unrest, but through strategic measures that undermined their independence while still appearing to respect their status. She revoked unlawfully seized lands, reasserted royal prerogatives, and curtailed the traditional privileges that had allowed nobles to administer their own justice. Through marriages, rewards, and a carefully balanced court culture, she kept the most powerful noble houses loyal or at least neutralized. To further stabilize her rule and maintain public order, Isabella oversaw the establishment of the Santa Hermandad, or Holy Brotherhood. This was a rural police force composed of local militias tasked with enforcing royal law, combating banditry, and ensuring the security of the countryside. Although the idea of the Hermandad was not entirely new, Isabella's innovation was to nationalize it, extending its reach and authority far beyond previous incarnations. Funded by taxes and coordinated across multiple provinces, the Santa Hermandad allowed the crown to project power into areas where previously local lords or criminal factions had held sway. Its harsh justice, swift trials and brutal punishments, was both feared and respected, deterring lawlessness and reinforcing the image of the monarchy as the ultimate guarantor of peace and order. Parallel to her efforts to tame the nobility and secure civil order, Isabella embarked on sweeping religious reforms that would permanently shape the identity of Spain. Her deep Catholic faith was not merely personal devotion but a political tool as well, a means of unifying her diverse subjects under a single religious banner. The Catholic Church held enormous wealth and influence, and Isabella sought to harness its power for the crown's purposes. She carefully aligned herself with reformist currents within the Church, particularly the observant movements that sought a return to stricter monastic discipline. By championing these reforms, Isabella both demonstrated her piety and asserted greater control over religious institutions, ensuring that monasteries and convents became centers of loyalty rather than independent fiefdoms. Her relationship with the papacy was equally strategic. While professing unwavering devotion to Rome, Isabella was astute in ensuring that the Spanish Church retained a degree of autonomy. She negotiated rights to appoint bishops and other high officials, a privilege traditionally reserved for the Pope. This allowed her to place loyalists in key ecclesiastical positions, further binding the Church to the monarchy. Isabella's religious policies culminated in initiatives like the eventual establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, although the early groundwork was laid in her drive for a spiritually and politically unified kingdom. By insisting on orthodoxy, she positioned herself as a champion of Catholicism, a role that granted her legitimacy both at home and abroad. As Isabella fortified her religious and political position, she recognized that legal and administrative reforms were essential to creating a lasting structure of governance. The legal system of Castile was a tangled web of local customs, royal edicts, and privileges granted by previous monarchs. Isabella's vision required a more uniform and predictable legal framework. She initiated efforts to codify laws, bringing coherence to the realm's justice system. These codifications did not merely compile existing statutes, they often reinterpreted or reformed them in ways that favored centralized royal authority. Clearer laws meant fewer opportunities for local lords or corrupt officials to manipulate the system for their own gain. Central to these reforms was the strengthening of royal courts. Isabella sought to ensure that justice emanated from the crown, not from feudal lords or municipal councils with their own agendas. Royal judges or oidores were dispatched throughout the kingdom to preside over appeals and serious cases, creating a legal network that made the king and queen's justice accessible even in the most remote areas. By bolstering the authority and professionalism of these courts, Isabella simultaneously provided her subjects with a measure of fairness, albeit on her own terms, and reinforced the perception that the monarchs were the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. Perhaps the most significant administrative innovation of Isabella's reign was the creation of the Consejo Real, or Royal Council. While earlier monarchs had relied on informal councils of advisors, Isabella institutionalized the practice, setting clear guidelines for membership, duties, and procedures. The Consejo Real was designed to be a body of skilled administrators and jurists, rather than simply a gathering of nobles seeking favor. Members were selected for their expertise, loyalty, and merit, reflecting Isabella's broader meritocratic leanings. The council advised the monarch on legislation, governance, and judicial matters, acting as both a think tank and an executive body that could translate royal will into effective policy. In reorganizing these structures, Isabella laid the groundwork for the modern Spanish state. Her reign turned what had been a relatively loose confederation of territories and semi-independent fiefdoms into a more coherent and centrally governed kingdom. This consolidation of power was not achieved overnight nor without resistance, but Isabella's skillful blend of force, diplomacy, religious fervor, and administrative acumen ultimately prevailed. The cumulative impact of Isabella's reforms can hardly be overstated. By reducing noble power, she broke the centuries-old tradition of aristocratic dominance over royal policy. By creating institutions like the Santa Hermandad and the Consejo Real, she constructed mechanisms through which the crown could enforce its will without relying entirely on the loyalty of great lords. By reforming the church and aligning religious institutions with royal interests, she imbued the monarchy with a sense of divine mission, making obedience to the queen not only a civic duty but a spiritual imperative. Through legal codification and the strengthening of the courts, she made royal justice a daily reality in the lives of her subjects. Isabella's reign was not without its controversies and hardships. Her religious reforms, particularly later in her life, would harden into an orthodoxy that left little room for dissent. Her consolidation of power, while successful in stabilizing the kingdom, sometimes came at the cost of local traditions and municipal freedoms. Nevertheless, the overall achievement of her reign was the creation of a powerful, unified, and respected monarchy capable of ambitious projects on the international stage. As the decades unfolded, Isabella's reforms bore fruit in ways even she may not have fully anticipated. The stability and centralization she achieved allowed Spain to embark on global explorations and conquests that would reshape the world. The very structures she put in place enabled her successors to launch campaigns that would culminate in the formation of one of the largest empires history had ever seen. In strengthening the monarchy, reforming the church, overhauling the legal system, and professionalizing administration, Isabella not only secured her own position but transformed the destiny of her people. Isabella's reign stands as one of the most significant in European history, precisely because of the deliberate and comprehensive nature of her reforms. She understood power not merely as something to be claimed, but something that needed to be organized, directed, and institutionalized if it was to endure. Her legacy is not simply that of a strong monarch, but that of a visionary state-builder whose work set the stage for Spain's golden age. The long and complex history of the Iberian Peninsula is deeply intertwined with the centuries-long conflict between Christian and Muslim forces, commonly referred to as the Reconquista. To understand the fall of Granada and its historical significance, it is essential to first grasp the background of the Christian-Muslim conflicts that had shaped the region for nearly 8 centuries. The origins of the conflict can be traced back to the early 8th century when Muslim forces, primarily Moors from North Africa, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swiftly conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula. Within a few years, the once dominant Visigothic Christian kingdoms had been displaced, and Islamic rule had been firmly established. However, pockets of Christian resistance persisted in the mountainous regions of the north. Over the centuries, these Christian enclaves gradually expanded southward, driven by a combination of religious fervor, economic motivations, and political ambition. The Reconquista was not a single unified campaign but rather a series of wars, truces, alliances, and rivalries among Christian and Muslim rulers alike. At times, Christian kingdoms such as Castile, Aragon, and Leon would fight amongst themselves as readily as they would against Muslim states. Similarly, internal divisions within the Muslim territories, such as the fragmentation of Al-Andalus into numerous Taifa kingdoms, often facilitated Christian advances. Throughout the Middle Ages, the balance of power shifted repeatedly, with periods of Muslim resurgence followed by Christian victories. By the mid-13th century, Christian forces had reconquered most of the peninsula, leaving only the Emirate of Granada as the last significant Muslim stronghold in Iberia. For over 2 centuries, Granada managed to survive, often through diplomatic maneuvers, tribute payments to Christian rulers, and occasional alliances. However, by the late 15th century, the The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 had united two of the most powerful Christian kingdoms, creating a formidable force poised to complete the Reconquista. The campaign against Granada was a meticulously planned and executed military effort. Ferdinand and Isabella approached the war with strategic patience, understanding that a direct and immediate assault on Granada would be risky and costly. Instead, they adopted a strategy of gradual attrition, systematically capturing surrounding towns and fortresses to isolate the city and weaken its ability to resist. The Christian forces relied heavily on the use of artillery, a relatively new but increasingly decisive technology in late medieval warfare. Sieges were a crucial component of the campaign, with Christian armies laying prolonged blockades to starve out the Muslim defenders. Notable sieges included the capture of key strongholds such as Ronda, Loya, and Malaga. Each victory tightened the noose around Granada, cutting off its access to external support and resources. Funding the campaign was a monumental task, but Isabella and Ferdinand demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and resourcefulness in securing the necessary financial resources. They leveraged the wealth of the Castilian crown, imposed special taxes, secured loans from wealthy nobles and merchants, and even obtained support from the Catholic Church, which viewed the war as a holy crusade. The papacy granted indulgences to those who participated in or contributed to the campaign, framing it as a religious duty akin to the earlier crusades to the Holy Land. Logistics were equally critical to the success of the campaign. Maintaining supply lines, transporting troops, and ensuring the availability of food, weapons, and equipment required careful planning and coordination. The establishment of military camps, the construction of roads and bridges, and the mobilization of artisans and engineers to build siege engines and fortifications all contributed to the Christian forces' ability to sustain their operations over several years. The final act of the campaign culminated in the siege of Granada itself, which began in the spring of 1491. The city, though still formidable, was beset by internal divisions, economic hardship, and a sense of inevitability regarding its fate. Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler of Granada, faced pressure from within his court and from the populace, many of whom recognized the futility of prolonged resistance. After months of siege, negotiations began between Boabdil and the Catholic monarchs. The resulting agreement, known as the Capitulations of Granada, was relatively generous by the standards of the time. It guaranteed the protection of the Muslim population's religious, legal, and property rights, at least in theory. On January 2, 1492, Boabdil formally surrendered the keys to the Alhambra, the magnificent palace fortress that symbolized Granada's splendor, to Ferdinand and Isabella. The fall of Granada marked the end of Muslim rule in Iberia and the completion of the Reconquista. The surrender of Granada had profound religious, political, and symbolic implications. For the Catholic monarchs and their contemporaries, it was first and foremost a triumph of Christianity over Islam. Spain was now seen as a bastion of Catholic orthodoxy, and the victory was celebrated as a divine endorsement of Ferdinand and Isabella's rule. The monarchs adopted the title Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, bestowed upon them by the Pope, reflecting their role as defenders of the faith. Religiously, the fall of Granada emboldened the Catholic Church's efforts to promote religious uniformity throughout Spain. While the initial terms of the surrender had promised tolerance for the Muslim population, these promises were gradually eroded in the following years. Pressure mounted on the Muslim and Jewish communities to convert to Christianity or face expulsion. In 1492, the same year as Granada's fall, the Alhambra decree was issued, ordering the expulsion of all Jews who refused to convert. The forced conversions and expulsions that followed were part of a broader effort to create a homogeneous Catholic kingdom. Politically, the conquest of Granada consolidated royal authority and enhanced the prestige of the monarchy. The successful conclusion of the Reconquista demonstrated Ferdinand and Isabella's military prowess, administrative competence, and religious devotion. It strengthened their position vis-à-vis the nobility, many of whom had participated in the campaign, and thus remained invested in the stability and prosperity of the united crowns of Castile and Aragon. The fall of Granada also had significant international repercussions. It enhanced Spain's standing among the other European powers, positioning it as a leading force in Christendom. The timing of the victory coincided with the beginning of Spain's overseas expansion, symbolized by Christopher Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic later in 1492. The resources and confidence gained from the successful conclusion of the Reconquista provided the Catholic monarchs with the means and motivation to support such ambitious ventures. In cultural terms, the conquest of Granada inspired a flourishing of literature, art, and historiography celebrating the Christian victory. Chroniclers such as Andrés Bernaldez and Hernando del Pulgar wrote detailed accounts of the campaign, often portraying it in heroic and providential terms. Poets and artists depicted the fall of Granada as a momentous and glorious event, reinforcing the narrative of Spain's divine mission. Yet, the aftermath of the conquest was not without its complexities and contradictions. While the fall of Granada was celebrated as a triumph of Christian unity, the reality on the ground was more nuanced. The coexistence of different religious and cultural traditions that had characterized much of Iberian history did not disappear overnight. Muslim communities, known as mudéjas, continued to live in Spain for several generations, often facing discrimination, marginalization, and eventually forced assimilation. Moreover, the methods used to enforce religious conformity, such as the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, revealed the darker side of the quest for unity. The Inquisition targeted not only Jews and Muslims but also converted Christians suspected of heresy, creating an atmosphere of fear and repression that would have lasting effects on Spanish society. Economically, the conquest of Granada brought new territories, resources, and opportunities, but it also entailed significant costs. The war had strained royal finances, and the integration of Granada into the broader Spanish realm required substantial administrative and military investment. Efforts to repopulate the region with Christian settlers, reorganize its governance, and suppress potential rebellions demanded careful management and further expenditure. The symbolism of the fall of Granada continued to resonate in Spanish history and national identity for centuries. It became a foundational myth of Spanish greatness, often invoked in later periods of imperial expansion, religious conflict, and national consolidation. The image of Ferdinand and Isabella standing triumphant at the gates of the Alhambra became an enduring emblem of Spanish unity and Catholic fervor. In retrospect, the fall of Granada can be seen as both an ending and a beginning. It marked the conclusion of the medieval Reconquista and the definitive establishment of Christian rule over the Iberian Peninsula. At the same time, it heralded a new era of Spanish history characterized by overseas exploration, empire building, and intense religious zeal. The forces unleashed by the conquest would shape not only Spain but also the wider world in profound and lasting ways. The Reconquista, culminating in the fall of Granada, thus stands as one of the pivotal chapters in European history. It encapsulates the complex interplay of religion, politics, culture, and ambition that define the medieval and early modern periods. The legacy of this epical event continues to be felt and debated to this day, a testament to its enduring significance in the collective memory of Spain and beyond. The final surrender of Granada also brought an era of architectural and artistic blending to a climax. The Alhambra itself, a jewel of Islamic architecture, stood as a silent witness to the centuries of Muslim civilization in Spain. After the conquest, Christian rulers repurposed and modified many Islamic structures, creating unique hybrids that embodied both destruction and continuity. The rich cultural heritage left behind by the Muslims of Al-Andalus influenced Spanish art, science, agriculture, and philosophy long after political control had shifted. In a broader Mediterranean and European context, the fall of Granada represented a shift in the balance of power. Muslim powers such as the Ottoman Empire remained formidable, but the loss of Granada signified the ebbing of Islamic political dominance in Western Europe. Spain's emergence as a unified Catholic kingdom foreshadowed its rise as a global imperial power in the 16th century, setting the stage for an era of Spanish dominance in world affairs. However, the triumphalism that followed the conquest should not obscure the profound human cost involved. The forced conversions, inquisitions, expulsions, and cultural suppressions that unfolded in the years after Granada's fall inflicted suffering on countless individuals and communities. The ideal of convivencia, the coexistence of Christians, Muslims, and Jews that had characterized parts of medieval Spain, gave way to an increasingly rigid and exclusionary definition of Spanish identity. The background, execution, and aftermath of the Reconquista and the fall of Granada reveal a complex tapestry of motivations, actions, and consequences. The completion of the Reconquista under Ferdinand and Isabella was a crowning achievement of their reign and a transformative moment in Spanish history. It brought about the religious unification of Spain, strengthened the monarchy, and laid the foundations for Spain's expansion into a global empire. Yet, it also initiated processes of exclusion and persecution that would cast long shadows over Spanish society. The fall of Granada remains a powerful symbol, a moment of triumph, loss, and profound historical change that continues to captivate historians and the broader public alike. The Spanish Inquisition, one of the most infamous institutions of religious persecution in history, did not emerge spontaneously. Its origins can be traced back to a complex blend of fear, politics, religious zealotry, and social anxieties that had been brewing in Spain for centuries. By the late Middle Ages, the Iberian Peninsula had undergone a profound transformation. After centuries of Christian-Muslim conflict, known as the Reconquista, the Christian kingdoms of Spain sought not only political dominance but also religious homogeneity. Yet within their newly reclaimed territories, large communities of Jews and Muslims persisted. Over time, a growing number of these populations had converted to Christianity, sometimes genuinely, often under pressure. These converts were known as conversos, if they were of Jewish origin, and moriscos, if of Muslim heritage. The conversions, however, did not resolve tensions. Suspicion lingered that many conversos and moriscos were insincere in their new faiths, secretly maintaining their former religious practices. The Christian population, already prone to resentment due to the economic prominence of some Jewish families, found a new justification for discrimination and violence. Religious authorities and monarchs alike feared that these false Christians could undermine the spiritual and social fabric of the fledgling Spanish state. This widespread paranoia provided fertile ground for a movement that would attempt to scrutinize, judge, and, when deemed necessary, punish those whose faith was called into question. The Spanish monarchy, newly unified under Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, saw an opportunity to solidify their rule through religious uniformity. They envisioned a Spain united not only by politics but by Catholicism, a vision that would justify harsh measures against religious dissent. In 1478, seeking to address the perceived threat of insincere conversions, Ferdinand and Isabella petitioned Pope Sixtus IV for permission to establish an inquisition under their direct control. The Pope granted this request, though not without reservations. Unlike earlier inquisitions managed primarily by the Church, the Spanish Inquisition would function as a tool of the monarchy. It would ensure not only the purity of the faith but also the stability of the state. From its inception, the Spanish Inquisition was granted extraordinary powers. It operated under the authority of royal-appointed inquisitors who answered directly to the crown, not to the Vatican. This arrangement allowed Ferdinand and Isabella to use the institution as a means of centralizing their power, weakening the nobility and church hierarchy that might otherwise challenge their authority. The structure of the Inquisition was carefully designed to be both hierarchical and expansive. At its apex stood the Inquisitor General, an office initially held by Tomás de Torquemada, a Dominican friar known for his zealous commitment to religious orthodoxy. Under his leadership, the Inquisition expanded rapidly across Spain, establishing local tribunals staffed by inquisitors, notaries, constables, and other officials. These courts followed a standardized procedure that was chillingly methodical. Accusations could be made anonymously, and once accused, individuals often had little recourse. They might be imprisoned for months or even years while awaiting trial. The accused were subjected to intense interrogations, often involving psychological or physical torture, in order to elicit confessions. Legal defense was practically non-existent, and many trials ended in convictions, often resulting in public penance, confiscation of property, imprisonment, or execution by burning. While the initial focus of the Inquisition was on conversos suspected of Judaizing, its scope soon expanded. Moriscos became another target, as did anyone suspected of heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, or moral offenses like bigamy and sodomy. Even Old Christians, those without recent Jewish or Muslim ancestry, were not immune if their behavior deviated from orthodox norms. The Inquisition's power created an atmosphere of pervasive fear. Neighbors, friends, and even family members could become informants, leading to a society marked by mistrust and paranoia. This pervasive climate of fear helped enforce not only religious conformity but also social and political obedience. The Spanish Inquisition was controversial almost from its inception. Even within the Catholic world, its methods and scope drew criticism. Pope Sixtus IV initially protested the excessive cruelty of Spanish inquisitors, though his influence was limited once the Inquisition became an arm of the Spanish crown. Some Spanish nobles, wary of the monarchy's growing power, also resisted the Inquisition's reach, though their objections were largely ineffective. Over time, the Inquisition's record became increasingly brutal. Thousands were executed, and countless more were subjected to imprisonment, torture, and public humiliation. Autos de fe, public ceremonies in which the sentences of the Inquisition were carried out, became macabre spectacles attended by large crowds. Those condemned to death were often burned alive, a fate considered a merciful alternative to eternal damnation by the standards of the day. Despite these atrocities, the Inquisition maintained a complex relationship with Spanish society. Some segments of the population genuinely supported its activities, believing that it preserved the purity of the faith and protected the social order. Others viewed it with fear, hatred, or resignation. Economic motives often lurked beneath religious justifications. The confiscation of property from the accused provided a lucrative source of income for the crown and for individual inquisitors, creating a perverse incentive to pursue prosecutions aggressively. Over time, the Inquisition became increasingly bureaucratic and self-sustaining, with officials dedicated more to preserving their own power than to any genuine religious mission. The long-term legacy of the Spanish Inquisition is profound and deeply ambivalent. On one hand, it contributed to the consolidation of Spain as a centralized, Catholic monarchy. By suppressing dissent and promoting uniformity, it helped Ferdinand and Isabella, and their successors, forge a more cohesive national identity. Yet this unity came at a terrible cost. Spain's intellectual life suffered as a result of the Inquisition's censorship and repression. Books deemed heretical were banned, and scholars who explored ideas deemed unorthodox faced persecution. Fear of the Inquisition stifled scientific inquiry and philosophical debate, contributing to Spain's eventual decline as a European intellectual power. Moreover, the Inquisition's obsession with purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, had enduring consequences for Spanish society. Lineage became a paramount concern, and individuals with any hint of Jewish or Muslim ancestry found themselves marginalized. This obsession with racial and religious purity sowed seeds of systemic discrimination that would persist for centuries, long after the Inquisition itself faded from prominence. The Spanish Inquisition also cast a long shadow over Spain's overseas empire. In the Americas, inquisitorial tribunals were established to monitor the faith of settlers and indigenous converts. The same mechanisms of fear, control, and coercion that operated in Spain were transplanted to the New World, where they often compounded the brutality of colonial conquest. Internationally, the reputation of the Spanish Inquisition became a source of condemnation and horror. Protestant countries, in particular, seized upon its excesses as evidence of Catholic tyranny and corruption. Pamphlets, paintings, and plays depicted the Inquisition as the embodiment of cruelty and fanaticism, a reputation that persists to this day. While some modern historians have attempted to nuance this image, noting that the Inquisition's death toll was lower than popularly believed, the broader reality of repression, torture, and injustice is undeniable. By the 18th century, the Spanish Inquisition had begun to decline. Enlightenment ideals of reason and tolerance gained ground, and secular authorities increasingly viewed the Inquisition as an anachronism. Reforms in the late 1700s curtailed its powers, and Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 effectively abolished it. Though briefly revived after the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, the Inquisition was permanently disbanded in 1834. Its demise marked the end of an institution that had, for over 3 centuries, wielded unparalleled power over the minds and bodies of Spain's inhabitants. In retrospect, The Spanish Inquisition stands as a grim testament to the dangers of religious zealotry combined with unchecked political power. It reveals how fear, of difference, of dissent, of the other, can be harnessed to justify almost any atrocity. It also serves as a warning of how institutions designed to enforce ideological conformity often evolve into engines of repression serving their own perpetuation rather than their ostensible mission. Yet the Inquisition's legacy is not only one of fear and death. It also shaped the Spanish national character in profound ways, instilling a deep conservatism and an enduring emphasis on religious and cultural identity. Understanding the Spanish Inquisition is essential for grasping the broader currents of Spanish and European history, for it encapsulates the perennial tension between faith and freedom, unity and diversity, authority and conscience. Even today, the very term Inquisition conjures images of injustice and terror. It is a symbol of the perils inherent in conflating religious orthodoxy with political power, and of the human cost when fear is allowed to override compassion. The Spanish Inquisition reminds us that history is not only a record of triumphs but also of profound moral failures, and that vigilance against intolerance remains a timeless necessity. The late 15th century was a period of remarkable transformation for Spain. Emerging from the long struggle of the Reconquista, Spain stood poised on the brink of a new era, one defined not merely by consolidation at home but by expansion across the globe. At the heart of this transformative phase was the voyage undertaken by Christopher Columbus in 1492, an event that would have repercussions far beyond the imagination of even the most visionary monarchs of the time. Initially, however, Columbus' proposals were met with skepticism. His ambitious plan to reach the Indies by sailing westward was not an entirely new idea. Navigators and scholars of the period were aware of the world's spherical nature. The problem lay in the calculations. Columbus severely underestimated the circumference of the Earth, believing Asia could be reached swiftly by his proposed route. His assertions contradicted the prevailing scholarly consensus, which, though correctly estimating the distance, deemed such a voyage impractically long with the ships and supplies then available. This skepticism made it difficult for Columbus to find backing for his project. He approached several European courts, including those of Portugal and England, and received rejection. However, after years of persistent lobbying and after the final victory of Ferdinand and Isabella in the Reconquista, Columbus finally found his patrons. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were newly emboldened by their unification of Spain and were eager to expand their influence. Religious zeal, economic ambition, and national pride combined to create an atmosphere receptive to bold ventures. Columbus' promise of new trade routes and untapped wealth aligned with their aspirations. In 1492, they agreed to sponsor his voyage, providing him with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a small crew. The outcomes of Columbus' voyage were monumental, though not in the way he had anticipated. Believing he had found a new route to Asia, Columbus instead stumbled upon lands previously unknown to Europeans, the islands of the Caribbean. While he continued to insist that he had reached the fringes of Asia, it became increasingly clear that these were entirely new continents. The discovery opened a floodgate of exploration, conquest, and colonization that would transform the world. It led to the exchange of crops, animals, ideas, and unfortunately, diseases, in what would later be called the Columbian Exchange. This intercontinental contact would bring immense wealth to Spain, but it would also initiate profound upheaval and suffering for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. As Spain moved quickly to claim vast new territories, the question of how to manage this expansion arose. Portugal, Spain's maritime rival, had also been expanding its influence, particularly along the coasts of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Tensions threatened to erupt between the two Catholic powers. To prevent conflict, Spain and Portugal turned to papal mediation. The result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494. This treaty effectively divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between the two powers along a meridian approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lands to the west of this line would belong to Spain, those to the east would belong to Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas had profound implications. It gave Spain a dominant position in the New World, laying the foundations for the Spanish Empire that would become the largest and one of the most powerful in history. Portugal, meanwhile, concentrated its efforts on Africa, Asia, and eventually Brazil, the one part of the New World that lay east of the demarcation line. The treaty was emblematic of the emerging European worldview that saw the globe as a space to be divided, conquered, and exploited. It reflected a profound shift toward globalization, imperialism, and the intertwining of political power with religious authority. Spain's emergence as a global empire reshaped international trade, warfare, and diplomacy for centuries to come. The initial voyage of Columbus was only the beginning. Inspired by the news of vast lands filled with potential riches, a series of expeditions followed. Spanish explorers, known as conquistadors, set out with a mix of motives: the pursuit of wealth, the thirst for adventure, and the desire to spread Christianity. Early expeditions in the Americas revealed the immense wealth of civilizations like the Aztecs and the Incas. Figures such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro led daring conquests that toppled these mighty empires. Their military successes were aided by factors such as superior weaponry, alliances with discontented indigenous groups, and the devastating impact of European diseases like smallpox, which decimated native populations. The process of colonization began rapidly. Spanish settlements were established throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America. These colonies became vital sources of wealth for Spain, especially as silver and gold flowed back to Europe in unprecedented quantities. The establishment of the encomienda system allowed Spanish settlers to extract labor and tribute from indigenous peoples, a practice that would have devastating consequences for native communities. Meanwhile, missions and religious orders sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. Religion was deeply interwoven with the imperial mission. Conversion was seen not only as a religious duty but also as a way to legitimize Spanish rule over new territories. Isabella of Castile, in particular, envisioned the expansion as a means of spreading Christianity across the globe. Her personal piety and strong sense of religious mission shaped Spain's colonial policies. She insisted that the indigenous peoples be treated as subjects of the crown, not as slaves, and called for their conversion rather than their extermination. Although her intentions may have been more humane than those of many conquistadors, the reality on the ground often diverged sharply from her vision. Reports of abuse, exploitation, and atrocities filtered back to Spain, leading to debates about the morality of conquest and the rights of indigenous peoples. These debates would continue for centuries, influencing the development of international law and human rights concepts. The voyages of exploration and the resulting colonization efforts profoundly altered Spain itself. Wealth from the Americas funded the growth of a powerful state apparatus, magnificent architectural projects, and military ventures across Europe. Spanish art, literature, and culture flourished during what came to be known as the Siglo de Oro, or Golden Age. At the same time, the influx of wealth contributed to inflation and economic distortions that would eventually weaken Spain's economy. Moreover, the focus on extracting resources from colonies discouraged the development of a strong domestic industrial base. The expansion also had a profound impact on global history. It initiated a new era of European dominance, colonialism, and the spread of European languages, religions, and cultures. The patterns established during this period, exploitation of indigenous populations, resource extraction, and cultural imposition, would be replicated by other European powers in the centuries to come. The Spanish model of conquest and colonization set the template for empire building in the modern world. Despite the enormous changes wrought by Spanish exploration and expansion, the process was not without its critics. Even in Spain, some voices questioned the morality of conquest and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas emerged to denounce the abuses committed in the name of empire. De las Casas, a former encomendero turned Dominican friar, became one of the most vocal advocates for indigenous rights, arguing that the natives were rational beings capable of receiving Christianity without coercion. His efforts led to reforms such as the new laws of 1542, which sought to curb the worst abuses of the encomienda system, though enforcement was often weak. Nevertheless, the momentum of empire building was difficult to halt. Economic interests, national pride, religious fervor, and sheer ambition drove further expansion. Spain continued to explore and claim new territories, from the American Southwest to the Philippines. Each new conquest brought new opportunities and new challenges. Managing a vast, far-flung empire required complex administrative structures, reliance on local intermediaries, and constant military vigilance. Over time, the realities of maintaining such an empire strained Spain's resources. Wars in Europe, resistance in the colonies, and competition from other emerging European powers like England, France, and the Netherlands eroded Spanish supremacy. The empire's zenith in the 16th century was followed by a gradual decline in the 17th and 18th centuries, culminating in the loss of most American colonies by the early 19th century. Yet the legacy of this period of exploration and expansion remains visible to this day. Spanish is spoken across vast swaths of the Americas. Catholicism remains a dominant religious force, and the cultural, political, and economic systems of many Latin American countries bear the imprint of their colonial past. In examining this critical phase of Spanish history, it is impossible not to recognize both its achievements and its tragedies. The voyages of Columbus and the conquests that followed opened the world to new exchanges of goods, ideas, and cultures. They connected continents that had previously developed in isolation from one another, setting the stage for the modern globalized world. Yet these developments came at an enormous human cost. The indigenous peoples of the Americas suffered catastrophic population losses, cultural disruption, and social upheaval. Entire civilizations were destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The story of Spanish exploration and expansion is one of both wonder and warning. It demonstrates the heights of human ambition and the depths of human cruelty. It reminds us that progress and suffering often walk hand in hand. And it challenges us to reflect on how the pursuit of glory and wealth can lead to unintended consequences that echo across centuries. Spain's imperial adventure reshaped the world, leaving a legacy that historians, philosophers, and citizens continue to grapple with today. At its core, this era represents a pivotal moment in human history. It was a time when oceans ceased to be barriers and became highways of conquest and communication. It was a time when local actions had global repercussions, when decisions made in the courts of Europe reverberated across the jungles of the Amazon and the deserts of New Mexico. It was a time when dreams of empire created new worlds, sometimes wondrous, sometimes nightmarish, for millions of people. The spirit of exploration that drove Columbus and those who followed him remains a powerful force in human affairs. It speaks to a fundamental aspect of the human condition: the desire to reach beyond the known, to discover, to understand, to conquer, and to create. But the history of Spanish expansion also serves as a cautionary tale about the responsibilities that come with power and the moral costs of ambition untempered by compassion and respect for others. Spain's voyages of exploration and their resulting empire transformed not only Spain but the entire world. In doing so, they initiated patterns of contact, conflict, and cultural exchange that continue to shape our global society. The legacy of this extraordinary period reminds us that history is never simple and that the stories we tell about our past must grapple with its complexity, its grandeur, and its pain. Isabella of Castile's personal life was deeply interwoven with her political ambitions, yet at its core, she was a woman of profound attachments and emotions. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was not just a strategic alliance but also a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and shared goals. From the very beginning, their union defied many of the conventions of royal marriages at the time. Isabella insisted on certain conditions before agreeing to marry Ferdinand, ensuring that she would retain her rights as Queen of Castile and not be relegated to a mere consort. This set the tone for a marriage of equals, where both sovereigns operated jointly, but Isabella never allowed herself to be overshadowed. Despite the political calculations behind their marriage, there was affection and camaraderie between Isabella and Ferdinand. They worked together seamlessly in governance, often conferring privately and presenting a united front to their courts and subjects. They complemented each other's strengths. Ferdinand was more militaristic and politically cunning, while Isabella was methodical, just, and deeply principled. Their letters to each other during times of separation reveal warmth, concern, and a strong personal bond uncommon in many royal unions of the era. Nevertheless, their marriage was not without tension. Political disagreements occasionally surfaced, especially when interests of Castile and Aragon diverged. Yet, they managed to maintain unity, driven by a shared vision of a unified and powerful Spain. As a mother, Isabella was devoted yet demanding. She took an active role in the upbringing and education of her children, emphasizing the same values she cherished: faith, duty, and a sense of destiny. Her children were seen as extensions of her mission to create a strong and pious Christian kingdom. Joanna, her second daughter, later known as Joanna the Mad, bore the heavy expectations of her mother and the burdens of dynastic politics. Isabella's daughter Catherine of Aragon would famously marry Henry VIII of England, bringing the influence of Spanish royal blood to the English court. Each of Isabella's children was used as a pawn in the grand chessboard of European alliances, yet Isabella was deeply invested in their well-being and often anguished over their fates. Isabella's maternal instincts were balanced with a pragmatic understanding of the harsh realities of royal life. She mourned deeply the deaths and misfortunes that befell her children, yet she never allowed personal sorrow to eclipse her duties as queen. Her approach to motherhood reflected the era's demanding expectations of royal women: produce heirs, forge alliances through marriage, and raise children capable of continuing the family legacy. Isabella's faith was perhaps the most defining element of her character. She was, above all, a daughter of the Catholic Church. Her religious convictions were not mere formalities of royalty but deeply personal and earnest. From an early age, Isabella was known for her piety, attending Mass daily, confessing frequently, and maintaining a rigorous schedule of prayers and religious observances. Her commitment to Catholicism was not confined to personal devotion but extended into her vision of governance and empire. She saw her role as queen not only as a political leader but as a spiritual guardian, responsible for the religious health of her kingdom. This intense faith manifested in her patronage of religious institutions. Isabella endowed monasteries, commissioned churches, and sponsored religious scholarship. She was a key supporter of the reform of Spanish monastic life, encouraging greater discipline and adherence to the original ideals of religious orders. The Queen worked closely with influential figures such as Cardinal Cisneros to reform the Spanish clergy, rooting out corruption and restoring moral authority. These actions had profound and lasting effects on the spiritual life of Spain, contributing to what would later be seen as the Spanish Golden Age of Catholicism. However, Isabella's religious zeal also had darker consequences. Her sponsorship of the Spanish Inquisition was driven by a genuine, if grim, desire to purify her realm from heresy. She believed religious unity was essential to political stability and national identity. While historians have debated her exact role in the Inquisition's excesses, it is clear that Isabella saw no contradiction between her compassion for individuals and the ruthless suppression of what she perceived as spiritual threats. Her expulsion of the Jews in 1492, for instance, was not a decision made out of cruelty for its own sake, but was aligned with her sincere conviction that religious homogeneity was necessary for the survival and flourishing of Christian Spain. In terms of personality and leadership traits, Isabella was a woman of remarkable intelligence and decisiveness. She received a superior education for a woman of her time, focusing on subjects like Latin, history, philosophy, and theology. She had a sharp mind and a prodigious memory, capable of grasping complex political situations and formulating effective strategies. Unlike many monarchs who relied heavily on advisors, Isabella was known to immerse herself in the details of governance. She read reports, corresponded directly with officials, and issued commands based on her own analysis. Her court was organized with efficiency and discipline, reflecting her personal commitment to good governance. Decisiveness was one of Isabella's hallmark traits. She rarely vacillated once she had made a decision, and she expected the same clarity of purpose from those around her. This trait made her a formidable leader in times of crisis, such as during the conquest of Granada or the complex negotiations surrounding Columbus's voyages. Her ability to make hard choices, even unpopular ones, allowed her to achieve extraordinary successes that eluded other rulers of her time. Pragmatism was another defining element of Isabella's leadership. She was not an ideologue, though she was deeply religious. She understood that politics often required compromise and patience. She carefully navigated the feudal landscape of Castile, balancing the competing interests of powerful noble families without ever surrendering royal authority. She reformed the legal system, strengthened the crown's finances, and fostered a professional army. These reforms were not pursued out of idealism but because they were necessary to create a stable and prosperous kingdom. Yet, Isabella's compassion was often in tension with her ruthlessness. Contemporary accounts describe her as gracious, courteous, and attentive to the poor and the sick. She was known to personally oversee charitable activities, offering alms, food, and support to the needy. Her court was more austere and moralistic than many of her contemporaries, reflecting her personal ethos. But when it came to matters of state, Isabella could be unyielding, even brutal. She did not shy away from harsh punishments for treason, rebellion, or heresy. In her mind, mercy was appropriate for individuals but not at the expense of the realm's security and moral health. The conquest of Granada is a prime example of this duality. Isabella insisted on fair terms for the defeated Muslim population, allowing them to retain their customs and religion initially. However, when revolts and resistance emerged, she supported harsher measures, including forced conversions. Her initial compassion gave way to pragmatic ruthlessness when she judged that tolerance endangered the stability of her kingdom. Isabella's leadership style was also characterized by a strong sense of personal responsibility. She viewed herself as accountable not only to her subjects but also to God. This belief infused her reign with a moral seriousness that was both admired and feared. She did not rule capriciously but according to a code of duty and service. Her legitimacy was based not merely on lineage but on her ability to deliver justice, maintain order, and advance the glory of Christendom. Her personal discipline extended to her daily life. Isabella dressed simply, avoiding the ostentatious displays common among European royalty. She preferred modesty and humility, not as affectations but as genuine reflections of her values. Her court, though splendid in achievements, was marked by a sobriety that set it apart from the decadence of neighboring courts. She surrounded herself with capable advisors but maintained ultimate authority, carefully weighing counsel before making final decisions. Isabella's personal life and character cannot be separated from her historical achievements. Her role as a wife and mother influenced her political strategies, forging alliances and securing her dynasty's future. Her deep faith shaped both her personal conduct and the religious policies that had such profound consequences for Spain and the world. Her intelligence, decisiveness, and pragmatism allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics and lay the foundations for the modern Spanish state. Her compassion, though genuine, was bounded by her ruthless sense of duty to God, crown, and country. Isabella remains a complex figure, a devout woman of faith who could sanction acts of cruelty, a loving mother who used her children as instruments of policy, a visionary leader who shaped history through both benevolence and severity. Her legacy, rich and contested, endures precisely because she embodied the contradictions and challenges of leadership in a turbulent age. She was a product of her time, yet she also transcended it, leaving a mark on history that few could rival. Through her personal life and indomitable character, Isabella of Castile forged not only a new Spain but also a new epoch in the history of the world. As Isabella of Castile entered the twilight of her life, the burdens of leadership, personal grief, and physical decline weighed heavily upon her. The last years of her reign were marked by a steady deterioration in health, compounded by the complex political issues surrounding the succession of her crown. Throughout her life, Isabella had been a figure of remarkable strength, but by the early 1500s, time had begun to erode the resilience that had defined her rule. One of the most acute challenges she faced was related to her children, especially her daughter Joanna, whose mental instability would come to pose significant problems for the future of Spain. The deaths of several of her children, including her son and heir, Prince Juan, and her beloved daughter Isabella, Queen of Portugal, left her bereft and anxious about the stability of her legacy. Prince Juan's death was particularly devastating. Having pinned her hopes for a smooth succession on him, Isabella now had to contemplate passing the crown to Joanna, who, although married to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, was increasingly showing signs of emotional and psychological instability. This situation caused Isabella profound distress, as the security of her realm had been her life's mission. Adding to her burdens was the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized European politics. Joanna's marriage to Philip linked Spain to the powerful Habsburg dynasty, but also introduced tensions that would complicate Spanish internal affairs. Philip's ambitions often clashed with Ferdinand's, and Isabella foresaw the dangers that might arise if the stability of Castile was compromised after her death. She was determined to do everything within her power to protect her kingdom's future, even as her own physical strength was fading. Isabella's health began to fail markedly in the early 1500s. She suffered from a variety of ailments, including fevers and fatigue, and historians suggest she may have been afflicted with dropsy, a condition involving swelling due to fluid retention, or possibly a form of cancer. Despite her declining health, Isabella continued to fulfill her royal duties with characteristic diligence. However, it was clear to those around her that she was no longer the indomitable figure who had united Spain, launched the Reconquista to its final victory, and sponsored voyages that would open up the New World. Recognizing the gravity of her situation, Isabella turned her attention to the question of succession with renewed urgency. She meticulously crafted a last will and testament that would reflect her lifelong dedication to the stability and unity of her realms. Her will, completed in October 1504, is an extraordinary document, not only for its legal precision but for the insight it provides into her mind and spirit at the end of her life. In her testament, Isabella reaffirmed the central tenets of her reign: the inseparability of Castile and Aragon, the preservation of Catholic orthodoxy, and the maintenance of justice for all her subjects. She designated Joanna as her heir to the Castilian throne but included specific provisions to safeguard the governance of the realm, recognizing Joanna's incapacity to rule effectively on her own. She stipulated that if Joanna were deemed unfit to govern, Ferdinand would act as regent until Joanna's son, the future Emperor Charles V, came of age. Through these measures, Isabella demonstrated not only her awareness of the political realities facing Spain, but also her determination to ensure a continuity that was as orderly and peaceful as possible. On November 26, 1504, Isabella of Castile died at the age of 53 in Medina del Campo. Her passing marked the end of an extraordinary era in Spanish and world history. She died surrounded by her loyal attendants and in accordance with the deep piety that had characterized her entire life. Even in her final days, she displayed a profound humility and religious devotion. She requested a modest burial, free from the ostentations that often accompanied royal funerals, and chose to be interred in the simple Franciscan convent of San Francisco in Granada, the city whose conquest had crowned her greatest military achievement. The impact of Isabella's death on Spain was immediate and profound. She had been the heart and soul of the unified Spanish kingdom, and without her steady hand, cracks quickly began to appear. Although her will had anticipated the challenges to succession, the reality proved even more turbulent than she had perhaps foreseen. Joanna's mental health rapidly deteriorated after her mother's death, and Philip the Handsome's attempts to seize power in Castile plunged the kingdom into political uncertainty. Ferdinand, who had been King of Aragon in his own right and co-sovereign of Castile with Isabella, moved quickly to assert his authority as regent of Castile, citing Isabella's will as the basis for his claim. Yet his position was not unchallenged. Philip and his Burgundian supporters sought to exclude Ferdinand from power, leading to a bitter power struggle that would continue until Philip's sudden death in 1506. During this time, Castile faced a period of instability that contrasted sharply with the unity and strength it had enjoyed under Isabella's rule. Ferdinand's eventual emergence as regent marked a critical turning point. Although he lacked the natural charisma and popular appeal of Isabella, Ferdinand was a shrewd and experienced politician. He managed to stabilize the situation temporarily, but it was clear that Spain's political future was now tied increasingly to the fortunes of the Habsburg dynasty through Joanna's son Charles. Indeed, Isabella's death not only ended her personal reign but also set the stage for the transformation of Spain into a leading European and global power under the rule of Charles V. Despite the political upheavals that followed her death, Isabella's legacy endured. In her lifetime, she had achieved more than perhaps any other monarch of her era. She had unified two powerful kingdoms into what would become modern Spain, completed the centuries-long Reconquista, established the Spanish Inquisition, a controversial and deeply consequential institution, and sponsored the voyages of Christopher Columbus, thus opening up the Americas to European exploration and colonization. Isabella's reign also had a profound impact on the Catholic Church and on the course of European history. Her staunch defense of Catholicism, exemplified by the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain and her support for the Inquisition, earned her both admiration and condemnation in different quarters. She became a model for Catholic monarchs elsewhere in Europe, and her example was cited during subsequent efforts to enforce religious conformity during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Her personal character continued to fascinate historians and biographers long after her death. She was seen as a complex figure, deeply pious yet capable of ruthless political maneuvering, compassionate to the poor yet harsh toward religious dissenters. In many ways, Isabella embodied the contradictions of her age: a deep commitment to faith and justice, coupled with an unrelenting drive for power and unity. In later centuries, Isabella's image would be shaped and reshaped according to changing historical perspectives. In the 19th century, Spanish nationalists celebrated her as a founding mother of the nation. In the 20th century, debates about imperialism, religious intolerance, and colonialism led to more critical reassessments of her legacy. Yet whatever the lens through which she is viewed, Isabella remains a towering figure in world history, a monarch whose actions fundamentally shaped the course of both European and global events. The immediate years following her death were also pivotal for the Spanish monarchy in terms of consolidation and expansion. With Ferdinand acting as regent and later marrying Germaine de Foix in an attempt to produce another heir, Spain entered a phase of dynastic maneuvering that would ultimately lead to the rise of Charles V as the most powerful monarch of his time. Charles would inherit not only Spain and its vast overseas empire but also the Habsburg lands in Europe, creating a realm over which the sun never set. Isabella's death marked not only the end of her personal influence but also a critical transition point for Spain. While Ferdinand managed to hold the realm together through political acumen, the true consolidation of the Spanish Empire would occur under Charles, whose inheritance of the crowns of Castile, Aragon, and Austria created one of the most powerful empires in history. In this sense, Isabella's careful planning and fierce dedication to securing her legacy bore fruit, even if she did not live to see the full realization of her dreams. Her will and testament would serve as an important political tool and a moral guidepost for future monarchs. It emphasized service to the realm, the necessity of Catholic faith, and the responsibilities of kingship as a divine trust rather than a personal possession. Isabella's vision of kingship as both a sacred duty and a means of enforcing moral order would continue to influence Spanish political thought for centuries. Even today, the life and death of Isabella of Castile command scholarly attention and public imagination alike. She remains a symbol of formidable leadership, national unity, and imperial ambition, but also a figure whose actions had deeply complex and often troubling consequences for millions, especially in the context of religious persecution and colonial expansion. In reflecting on Isabella's final years, death, and immediate aftermath, it becomes clear that her life story cannot be easily categorized. She was both a product of her time and a transformative agent who reshaped her world. Her death may have created a vacuum of leadership in the short term, but the institutions, ambitions, and visions she left behind ensured that her influence would endure long after her passing, setting the stage for Spain's emergence as one of the greatest powers in world history. Isabella I of Castile left a legacy that resonates through the annals of history, not just because of the significant transformations she enacted during her reign, but because of the continued influence her policies, vision, and decisions had on Spain and the wider world. After her death, her heirs would consolidate her work, making Spain a global superpower that dominated European politics and overseas territories. However, her legacy is not without controversies, especially in relation to the Spanish Inquisition and her policies toward Jews and Muslims, which have been the subject of extensive debate. As historians and scholars continue to revisit her life and reign, a complex portrait of Isabella emerges, with her legacy often divided between admiration and criticism. One of the most enduring aspects of Isabella's legacy is the unification of Spain under her heirs. When she married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, it was a personal union that, over time, would lead to the political unification of Castile and Aragon. Although the two kingdoms maintained separate institutions and laws, The marriage allowed Isabella and Ferdinand to work toward a common goal, creating a unified Spanish monarchy. Upon Isabella's death in 1504, Ferdinand assumed regency over Castile on behalf of their daughter Joanna, but it was her son, Charles V, who would inherit both Castile and Aragon, as well as the vast territories of the Habsburg dynasty, including much of modern-day Europe and the Americas. Under Charles, Spain would emerge as the first true global empire, an empire that spanned continents, from the Americas to the Philippines, and became the wealthiest and most powerful in Europe for centuries. Isabella's reign also set the foundations for Spanish dominance in Europe and the Americas. The Reconquista, completed in 1492 with the fall of Granada, marked the end of centuries of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. This achievement not only strengthened her authority at home, but also gave her the opportunity to consolidate Spain as a Catholic stronghold. The same year, Isabella sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage, which would eventually lead to the discovery of the New World. This, combined with subsequent explorations, ensured that Spain would become one of the leading colonial powers, establishing vast empires in the Americas. The riches from these colonies would fuel Spain's dominance in Europe, allowing it to influence global trade and politics. Isabella's vision of Spain as a superpower with a global reach was realized after her death, with her heirs building upon the foundation she laid. Another key aspect of Isabella's legacy lies in her influence on monarchical rule. During her reign, she established a strong, centralized monarchy that significantly reduced the power of the nobility and established greater control over the regions of her realm. This centralization helped maintain political stability during a time of fragmented kingdoms in Europe, setting the stage for the modern nation-state. Isabella's ability to command loyalty from her subjects, enforce royal authority, and implement reforms established her as a model for future monarchs. Her reign offered a precedent for monarchs such as Elizabeth I of England and Catherine the Great of Russia. Like Isabella, these rulers understood the importance of strengthening the power of the crown to maintain control and stability. Elizabeth I of England shared several key similarities with Isabella. Both queens faced the challenge of managing religious strife within their realms, Isabella with the Jews, Muslims, and the Catholic Inquisition, and Elizabeth with the Protestant Reformation and Catholic opposition. Both monarchs also ruled during times of intense political maneuvering, facing threats from within and outside their borders, but each succeeded in maintaining control over their respective kingdoms. Both women also emphasized the importance of maintaining their sovereignty and authority, often overriding the power of the nobility in the interest of strengthening the monarchy. Catherine the Great of Russia, too, saw Isabella as a model of effective leadership. While Catherine's empire was geographically much larger and politically distinct, she admired Isabella's centralization of authority and her ability to bring stability to a kingdom marked by regional fragmentation. Catherine's own reign was characterized by similar efforts to centralize power in Russia, reduce the power of the nobility, and create a more cohesive empire. In this sense, Isabella's leadership style, which emphasized control, order, and reform, would become a model for future European monarchs. However, Isabella's legacy is not without significant controversies, particularly in relation to the Spanish Inquisition and her policies toward Jews and Muslims. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 was one of her most contentious actions, and its repercussions continue to influence historical debates. The Inquisition was initially intended to root out heresy within Spain, particularly among converted Jews, conversos, and Muslims, Moriscos, who were suspected of secretly practicing their former faiths. The Inquisition, which became a powerful and terrifying institution, led to widespread torture, executions, and persecution of non-Catholics, as well as the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims. The use of the Inquisition to consolidate religious and political control in Spain has been heavily criticized, especially for its cruelty and the devastating impact it had on entire communities. The question of Isabella's role in the Inquisition is a subject of ongoing debate among historians. Some view her as a defender of Catholic orthodoxy, ensuring the purity of the faith in her kingdom and preventing what she saw as the dangers of religious dissent. Others argue that her zeal for religious unity led her to sanction an institution that caused untold suffering, a stain on her legacy. The Inquisition not only brutalized the Jewish and Muslim populations of Spain but also led to the expulsion of Jews in 1492, and later, the forced conversion of Muslims. The expulsions were part of a broader trend of religious persecution during Isabella's reign, and these policies continue to evoke strong criticism, with many questioning the morality of her actions. The forced conversions and expulsions of Jews and Muslims were part of a larger pattern of religious intolerance that shaped Spain's identity during Isabella's reign. Her efforts to create a homogeneous Catholic society, although politically expedient in the context of her time, are now viewed as a tragic chapter in Spain's history. Her decisions alienated vast segments of the population, decimated Jewish and Muslim communities, and stripped Spain of valuable intellectual and economic contributions. These actions remain a source of moral scrutiny, with critics arguing that Isabella's religious zeal led to unnecessary cruelty and suffering. In the modern era, the historiography surrounding Isabella has evolved significantly. Early historical portrayals of Isabella were overwhelmingly positive, casting her as a heroic figure who helped shape Spain into a major European power. Over time, however, scholars have reassessed her reign, recognizing the darker aspects of her policies, particularly the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. Today, historians often grapple with Isabella's legacy as a monarch who balanced remarkable achievements with policies that had profound human costs. In recent years, the portrayal of Isabella has been further complicated by attempts to beatify her. In 1974, the Catholic Church initiated a process to canonize Isabella, in recognition of her piety and religious devotion. However, the beatification process has been controversial, as many see her actions, especially the Inquisition, as incompatible with the Church's teachings on human dignity and religious tolerance. Some argue that canonizing Isabella would amount to a whitewashing of the darker aspects of her reign, while others contend that her personal devotion to Catholicism should be recognized, separate from the politics of her reign. Isabella's legacy in popular culture is similarly multifaceted. She has been portrayed as both a hero and a villain in various historical novels, films, and documentaries. Some works emphasize her strength, wisdom, and commitment to her kingdom, while others highlight the more authoritarian aspects of her reign. In literature and film, Isabella is often depicted as a powerful, regal figure who made difficult decisions in the service of her faith and her country. Yet, in more critical portrayals, she is shown as a queen whose unrelenting zeal for religious uniformity led to unnecessary suffering and persecution. In modern scholarship, Isabella's legacy is increasingly understood as complex and multifaceted. While she undoubtedly played a crucial role in shaping the course of European and world history, her reign also left scars that continue to haunt Spain and the broader world. She remains a figure who represents both the triumphs and the darker sides of early modern Europe, and her legacy will likely continue to be debated for generations to come. Ultimately, Isabella's long-term legacy is one of both remarkable achievement and profound controversy. Her role in unifying Spain, expanding its empire, and laying the groundwork for its emergence as a global superpower cannot be overstated. However, her legacy is also marked by the religious persecution that occurred under her rule, particularly through the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. The complexity of Isabella's legacy, shaped by both her accomplishments and her policies, continues to provoke debate, and her reign remains one of the most fascinating and contentious periods in European history. Isabella I of Castile's reign marks a pivotal moment in European history, characterized by both extraordinary achievements and notable flaws. As one of the most powerful monarchs of the late 15th century, her influence extended far beyond the borders of Spain. Isabella's accomplishments reshaped the political, religious, and cultural landscape of not only Spain but Europe as a whole. However, her legacy is a subject of ongoing debate, as her reign was also marred by controversial policies, particularly her involvement in the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. To fully understand Isabella's impact, it is essential to reflect on both her remarkable successes and the complexities of her rule. Isabella's most enduring achievement is her role in the unification of Spain. Through her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, she laid the groundwork for the eventual political consolidation of Castile and Aragon. While these kingdoms retained separate identities and systems of governance, the union allowed Isabella and Ferdinand to rule jointly over much of the Iberian Peninsula. This unification was instrumental in establishing Spain as a powerful European monarchy, setting the stage for Spain's emergence as a global superpower in the following centuries. The combined strength of Castile and Aragon under Isabella's leadership laid the foundation for the Habsburg dynasty's eventual control over vast territories in Europe and the Americas. Isabella's role in the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 is another central pillar of her reign. The conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, marked the end of nearly 800 years of Christian-Muslim conflict in Spain. This victory not only strengthened Isabella's political authority but also bolstered her religious credentials, as she positioned herself as a defender of Catholicism. The fall of Granada symbolized the triumph of Christian Spain, solidifying Isabella's image as a protector of the faith. The Reconquista also allowed for the further consolidation of royal power, as the Catholic monarchs sought to control the territories they had just conquered and ensure that their authority extended across the entire peninsula. Equally significant was Isabella's sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World in 1492. While Columbus's journey initially met with skepticism from many quarters, Isabella's decision to fund the expedition forever changed the course of history. Columbus's discovery of the Americas opened the door for Spanish exploration and colonization, ultimately establishing Spain as the dominant colonial power in the Western Hemisphere. The riches extracted from the New World fueled Spain's political and economic power, leading to its dominance in Europe and its global influence. Isabella's reign also saw considerable administrative and legal reforms. She reduced the power of the nobility, creating a more centralized state and establishing the foundation for modern Spanish governance. Her efforts to strengthen the monarchy, reduce corruption, and increase royal authority contributed to the stability of the kingdom and allowed for a more cohesive approach to ruling. Additionally, Isabella's support for the Catholic Church and her patronage of religious reforms, particularly in the monasteries, helped solidify her authority as a Catholic monarch. She worked closely with the papacy, ensuring that the Church's influence aligned with her own political goals, further reinforcing her position as a ruler with divine approval. However, despite these remarkable achievements, Isabella's reign was not without its flaws. The most significant and enduring criticism of her rule stems from her involvement in the Spanish Inquisition, which she established in 1478 with the goal of rooting out heresy among Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity. While the Inquisition was initially intended to protect the Catholic faith, it became a tool for political control and religious persecution. Thousands of Jews and Muslims were forced to convert to Christianity or face expulsion from Spain, while many others were subjected to torture and execution. The Inquisition's brutality has led to ongoing debates about Isabella's moral legacy, with many historians questioning whether her actions can be justified by the political and religious context of the time. The expulsion of Jews in 1492, a direct consequence of the Inquisition, is another aspect of Isabella's reign that continues to be viewed critically. While Isabella justified the expulsion by arguing that it was necessary for the purity of the Catholic faith, it resulted in the displacement and suffering of tens of thousands of Jews, many of whom had made significant contributions to Spanish society. The loss of Jewish communities deprived Spain of a wealth of intellectual, cultural, and economic resources, and the expulsion left a lasting scar on the country's history. Despite these flaws, Isabella's reign and her contributions to Spain's rise as a European and global power cannot be understated. Her unification of Spain, the successful completion of the Reconquista, and her support for exploration and colonization set the stage for Spain's dominance in Europe and the Americas. Furthermore, her ability to navigate complex political situations, consolidate power, and centralize authority established her as one of the most capable rulers of her time. Isabella is often referred to as Europe's first great queen, because of her pioneering role as a powerful female monarch in a male-dominated world. Her reign set a precedent for future women in positions of power, proving that a queen could not only rule effectively but also leave a lasting imprint on history. While her rule was marked by moments of cruelty and religious intolerance, her legacy as a unifier of Spain, a patron of exploration, and a symbol of Catholic authority endures. In many ways, Isabella's reign can be seen as a turning point in European history, marking the transition from medieval to early modern Europe. In modern history, Isabella's reign continues to be studied and debated. Her role in the Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, and her aggressive religious policies have led to a re-evaluation of her legacy, especially in the context of contemporary values of religious tolerance and human rights. Some view her as a tyrant, while others see her as a queen who made difficult decisions in a time of religious and political turmoil. The contrast between her achievements and her flaws makes her a complex figure, one whose reign cannot be easily categorized as either wholly positive or negative. Nevertheless, Isabella's influence on the course of history remains undeniable. Her reign helped shape the future of Spain, Europe, and the Americas, and her legacy as a monarch who navigated the challenges of her time with intelligence, determination, and religious fervor continues to resonate. As the first great queen of Europe, Isabella's impact extends beyond her own era, and her reign remains a subject of fascination and controversy for historians, scholars, and the public alike.